Good evening, film fans. Thank you for joining us for our last Monday night discussion of the calendar year. Not to worry, we'll be back in January. I'm Jacob Mazer. I'm the Director of Programs and Education at Bryn Mawr Film Institute, and I'll be one of your moderators this evening. Here to discuss the film with me is Dr. Amy Corbin of Muhlenberg College. Amy, how goes?
Very good. Happy to be here.
We're glad to have you. Tonight, we will be discussing Persepolis from 2007, directed by Marjane Satrapi and Vincent Perronneau. The film is adapted from Satrapi's comic book memoir of the same name. This is an interesting film and rather timely one, if I may say so. But before we launch into our discussion, let me touch on a couple of protocols. All right, so if you have a question or comment, please use that raise hand icon. You're going to see that marked at the bottom of the slide. Use that. That's how we'll know that you would like to speak. Let me also ask that you please keep your audio on mute unless you're asking a question. Once you're called on, please unmute yourself and share your remarks. And please remember to mute yourself once more when you've finished speaking. Now, you'll also see the icon for the chat function. If you'd prefer to participate in the conversation that way, fair game. Just type your thoughts in that chat. We'll keep our eye on the comments and we'll do our best to bring those questions and thoughts into the discussion. Finally, if you're joining our film discussion community for the first time, well, welcome. Thanks for hanging out with us. We encourage you to use that chat function to introduce yourself and let us know from where you are joining us. So with that said, let's get into our discussion. I see we have a hand up already, which is David Glussman. David and Janice, please unmute yourself, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, it's good to see you again. It's good to be seen. It was great seeing you at the theater last week. I'll put in a real quick pitch for anybody that hasn't come to BMFI to see The Fabelmans. Please don't miss it. I'm not usually a big fan of animated films. I used to think, I guess before I got a little more sophistication out of BMFI and a few other places, that they were beneath me. This is certainly the opposite. This is a film, at least in my way of looking at it, that has taken animation to a very different level. I think it's a higher level, but I certainly view it as a very different level. The ability to accompany the verbal story in almost entirely black and white. One of the reviewers talks about an occasional guest appearance by color, which I thought was just a interesting way of describing the splashes that we would occasionally get. The story itself, of course, is two books. But you know, one of the things that I looked at and sort of was thinking about a little bit as I'm watching is this idea that this young woman, as she's growing up in a very, very different environment than anybody on this call most likely grew up in. There may be an exception that I'm not aware of. But she was going through many of the same adolescent growing pains and issues and what I guess is called coming of age. And I guess I'd like to have the two of you give us a few thoughts on the similarities and differences because of her strict religious upbringing, of how challenging it was for her, both being in Iran and as well as when she was, I'll call it free, in Vienna, and how she wrote about it and really how they interpreted it for our film. Thank you both for the introduction. Not a film I would have necessarily gone to myself, but I am so glad that you got me there.
Thanks, David. You've brought a lot of interesting stuff to the table, some themes that I hope that we can continue to build on through the course of our conversation. And perhaps you out there in the audience have follow-up questions as well. David touched on the film's use of the animation medium. We can certainly discuss how Satrapi and her co-director used that to develop the story and to create a language to tell it that might not have been available to them were it a live action film. You touched on the coming of age angle. certainly one of the major themes of the story, and we should talk about how this coming of age differs and does not differ from coming of age stories that may take place in locales closer to home. And you've mentioned some other things as well. So Amy, let me turn things over to you here. Do you have any first thoughts to follow David's question?
Yes. First of all, I'm so happy that that this is a film you wouldn't have seen otherwise, but did see. That's one of the things I love about these online film discussions. So in terms of the coming of age, I think, yeah, it's really perceptive to, to identify that as sort of a genre, I guess, but the coming of age story for an American teenager would clearly look a lot different. I think that her upbringing was actually not that strict. I think one of the interesting things is that for those of us who maybe don't know that much about Iranian culture, like we see the diversity of reactions to the government that comes in and the fundamentalist regulations. And it's a real contrast to what her home life is like. Like her parents, are kind of irreverent. Certainly her grandmother, right, is hilariously irreverent, sort of making snide comments about people, which is kind of like my grandmother. So I kind of, in a weird way can relate to that. But they seem actually to be in favor of Margie being outspoken and rebelling against authority to some extent. And that's one of the usually points of conflict in a coming of age story, right? Is that the adolescent is rebelling against maybe family or maybe the small town they grew up in or whatever. And and here it's almost like I read it as Margie and her family are at odds with what's happening around them in Tehran and in their country overall. So in a sense, like her rebellion is almost, I think, endorsed a little bit by her family, but then they at some point are worried about her and feel like she's not going to be safe if she keeps speaking out. But another thing I think is interesting about the coming of age is that we see sort of the personal and political at the same time. So like I'm thinking of the scene where she's a child and she sort of starts to hear about some of the violence and even torture, right? She's sort of vaguely aware that this is happening, but she play acts it with like friends and it's funny to them, right? Like, oh, let's like catch somebody and pretend we're going to torture them. And, to me, that is a moment in the film that's so complex because in a sense you're like, oh, that's kids are always imitating what they hear grown-ups talking about, or they're always being a bully or ganging up on some kid. But then the sort of horrific layer of it is that that this stuff is really happening, and the kids are trying to process it and they don't really understand it, so they kind of think it's funny, but they kind of think it's edgy and scary. And so that to me is just one example of how it sort of shows like what we might think of as somewhat I hesitate to say anything as universal, but a pretty widespread adolescent experience or childhood experience of sort of playing with boundaries and taboos and violating them to be rebellious. But at the same time, it's also her coming of age of sort of understanding the politics and the history of her country and why it's at the place that it's at now. So those are some coming of age thoughts. I can also talk about animation, but like maybe we can move on to other topics and come back to that.
Let's swing back around to animation. If I can sort of tag along to some of your comments, Amy. I think those are really perceptive points to note. One thing that great art does, I think, is that it can kind of connect a specific experience to a universal experience. And right, it's interesting. This is a very unusual environment, or for us, it is a unusual environment. But there are a number of places where we see the things that she's working out are universal questions in certain ways. I love the scene that you mentioned, Amy, talking about. I think you're talking about the scene where she and her buddies are very young and they single out a classmate whose father they understand to be part of the regime and somebody who's involved in the regime's violence, right? And so, right, there's a sense in which they're sort of making sense of or sort of grappling with their scenario and whatever tools they have and whatever context they have, from their station. They're also working out a thing that basically everybody in life needs to work out, which is sort of how do we situate ourselves among our fellows? How do we behave among our fellows? And especially, how do we treat each other in times of duress and times of stress? And the lesson that she takes away, from the experience, which is delivered by one of her family members, I think it's her mother, is basically, the sins of the father are not the sins of the son. You need to judge people on their own terms, which is not, a lesson that is specific to Iran in its immediate post-revolutionary period. This is something that we all come to. In a way, Amy, the scene that you touched on, I think, is sort of rhymed with the scene later in the film when she's gone to Europe and returned, where she has this encounter with the police, and she's very made up because she's meeting a paramour. Mm-hmm. And in order to avoid getting in trouble with the morality police, she kind of deflects their attention by pointing them towards a fellow who was kind of ogling her, and he gets in trouble for it. And then she has this sort of encounter with her grandmother, too, which is, we always have a choice in what we do. In many ways, if you were, I think, to sort of boil down the sort of basic moral and basic human questions of the film that the character is encountering, and the sort of things about life that she needs to grasp, these are universal things. I mean, these points are what any coming of age experience sort of draws its protagonist to encounter. Here we see it played out in a very personalized place, and also with a sort of stakes that are maybe a little bit higher than what you might see in, say, a 1980s John Hughes movie. Mm-hmm. I see we have another hand from Deborah. Deborah, looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Please unmute yourself and let us know what's on your mind.
Well, I was thinking about how, children work out what their anxieties are.
Yeah.
And so it's, during COVID, my grandkids would always tell me that this animal, the stuffed animal just got a shot. And I didn't get it shot. And this, and I have a picture of my granddaughter at 6 giving shots to her teddy bear. And this is what children do. So if they're playing torture, it's because they're anxious. Mm-hmm. And you're right, processing. This is what they do to process, to not be anxious, or when they play going to the hospital, or they play the doctor, or, mommy and daddy are fighting. This is what kids do.
It's well observed. I mean, and as you say, we see Marjan working through some of this in the film. Amy, did you want to respond to anything that Deborah brought up?
My first thought is just that I recognize that because my children play doctor on me all the time, and it's a wonderful thing to do when you're tired, because you can just lie on the couch and they pretend to operate on you. But yes, I mean, in terms of the film, I said a lot of what I had to say about sort of the coming of age, but another scene that comes to mind based on Deborah's comment is she's sort of marching through the house, and I forget what she's saying, but she's chanting a slogan that she learned at school. And so that's one of the other things I think that's part of a coming of age narrative often is, schooling and what happens at school. But here, again, we have the sort of added layer of a government that is using school to indoctrinate children. And that's really easy to do too, because I could, think of a lot of examples where my kids come home from school and, they saw some presentation that had a song and they're just singing it, so they'll repeat what they've heard at school, and especially if it was presented as something that's fun or school spirit or whatever, like they're all in 100% at the elementary school age. And so we see sort of the parents looking at her like a little concerned because, they again have their own fairly independent political views and against the government. And here's their daughter sort of marching through the room, shouting the propaganda that she was taught at school. So you can really see that. And then maybe as a contrast to that would be when she's in art class as, as a young adult, and she's extremely outspoken about, how ridiculous it is that that they have to draw, a figure who's entirely clothed in a kind of draped cloth, which doesn't give them the art experience that most art students have when they're working off of a human model, right? Which is to be able to see the human body and see all the curves and the wrinkles. And, it's a challenging drawing experience. So she doesn't get that because the model is in this burqa. But anyway, and there's, a couple moments in her college years where she becomes quite outspoken and sort of mocks the propaganda they're getting at school. So that's an interesting contrast, I guess, to think of, Margie as a little kid, sort of being a sponge and just soaking everything up and spouting out words that she doesn't really know what she's saying. And then, contrasting that to the way she acts in college.
Yeah, it's interesting. We even see her doing that in the pre-revolutionary period, right? Because she has this kind of, she talks about like being, I feel like there's a period where she is saying like, yes, we love the Shah. Yes, we love the Shah, which is what she's being told at school. And then, the messaging switches and she
switches. Yeah.
Right. But, we also see her, and this is due to the influence of a number of authority figures, or let's say parental figures or family figures, who influence her in her life. We start to see her sort of beginning to separate herself from just being that mode of repeating and sort of going along with whatever's said. This really is part of her personality. This is like part of her ethos, which is that she's she can't, as we see her get older, and we see that she can't abide the injustice. Like there's never a period where she can settle with ease into keeping her mouth shut and just letting things go. It's one of the things maybe that makes her sort of unique. It seems like among some of her fellows too, who may share her sentiment, but who are more reserved about speaking out, and more sympathetic perhaps to the reasons why that might be. I see we have a hand from Sophia. Sophia, looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Please unmute yourself. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about using a child as a vehicle for a political story. And kind of, I remember reading a while ago that a lot of filmmakers in countries where there's dictatorships or totalitarian governments, they often tell children's stories because those are less controversial. They can kind of maybe sneak in a political message and it'll just look like a little kid's story. And you see that in like Franco's Spain. So many of the great movies from that era are about children. And you also see it a lot in Iran too, with like White Balloon or Children of Heaven. And they kind of really look not political at all, but you can definitely find some politics in there. And this seems really different because it's not using a child's point of view to avoid controversy, but kind of like explain it and confront it. And I think that's what sets it aside as kind of an Iranian exile movie, I think, because I think the only way for Western audiences to understand kind of the ridiculousness of a revolution and the twists and turns is to see it through a child's eyes, because you kind of see how people who, at one point they're marching, down with the Shah, down with all those governments, like they end up working with like the Ayatollah and his vision. It makes no sense. And I mean, that's kind of how a lot of those fallen revolutions are.
Well said, Sophia. Amy, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree that, in some of the other films you mentioned, the sort of child's world can sort of deal with politics in a more like allegorical or, symbolic way where it's not quite as clear what we're really talking about, because it's through the eyes of a child. But this is really different because maybe because it's autobiographical. And so, it's an adult satrapi, sort of looking back on her childhood and sort of illustrating the ways in which she was forced to confront things a lot earlier than most children would. But also, obviously, she's working from France, and so she, as you say, it's a diaspora film, and so they're not worried about the kind of censorship that they definitely would encounter if they were making this in Iran or other countries with similar sort of religious and autocratic governments.
Indeed. Yeah. I mean, very perceptive points indeed, Sophia. You mentioned some of the great films from Franco's Spain, and, I'm thinking of stuff like The Spirit of the Beehive or Cría Cuervos, and, as well as some of the films from, 1980s Iran. And, a lot of those too are from, both in Spain and in Iran in that period, there was, film censorship. So, in a way, this was the sort of language that, filmmakers had at their disposal to tell their stories and to sort of make their points and to leverage their arguments without, and still have their film be seen and without getting into trouble. There's always this kind of dance between censors and artists, how much can we put forward? How much will we allow? I think you've kind of touched on an interesting dynamic in the film too, which we haven't talked too much about, which is the East-West dynamic, which is, we can see as a sort of binary in these two forces clashing with each other, or we can maybe pick that apart. And I sort of sense that Satrapi wants us to be, a little skeptical of the sort of hard division between, Europe and the Middle East, or, quote, 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 the Orient, as, it would have been known in like the 1960s, in Western Europe. So, I mean, maybe that's something that we can develop in our conversation too. Amy, do you want to talk about East-West in this film?
Yeah, sure. That's one of the reasons I love this film so much, because I think the binary is there, but the walls between the two sides are so porous. So from the start, Satrapi's family is obviously very well educated. Some of them have traveled abroad. And of course, there's the uncle that goes to Russia and sort of, gets a PhD in Marxism. And Western thought, slips in that way. She's going to a French speaking school. But then there is sort of the popular culture of the 1980s that she absorbs, so she's got the punk is not dead, where she writes in the back of her jacket, but she spells either punk or dead wrong. I forget which one, but, she's going in that alley to buy, bootleg cassette tapes of, punk bands and heavy metal bands. And so I find that a really interesting sort of illustration of the way that Western, or, mostly American culture in terms of the bands, the way that sort of takes on new meanings when it's in a new context. Actually that gets us back to coming of age and adolescent rebellion, right? So, listening to like awful heavy metal music that makes your parents' ears hurt is a classic way of rebelling. But for her, again, that does seem to me as her primary motive, right? She's not trying to shock her parents, really, because her parents are not very easily shocked. And instead, her sort of rocking out to this music and try to get punk records and stuff is all about rebelling against the social constraints and the government oppression that she's seen, directly affect her family, and she sees all around her. So, so in that way, right, there's all of these like parts of Western European and American culture that are already mixed in with Iranian society. So I think, it's an important reminder for people to, to sort of see the ways in which popular culture and literary culture and philosophy and stuff, travels in ways, and then also gets sort of new meanings. But then the other thing, right, is that it's not a sort of black and white, the West equals freedom, and that's so great, because when she's in Vienna, she explores a lot of the countercultures there. but is really turned off by the sort of nihilism, right, of these disaffected European teenagers who are like, well, nothing matters, there's nothing worth fighting for, because everything is corrupt and rotten. And that sort of strikes her at the core, I think, because she's like, my family was fighting for things that really do matter. And so she can't really get on board with that kind of sort of rebellious Western teenage culture. And then when she's back in Iran, I forget who she's talking to, but she said, oh, it's the guy she marries, right? And he wants to go to Europe. And she's like, well, in Europe, they don't care if you can die on the streets and they don't care. And so, at that point, we can really see that there's elements of both that she longs for. Like, she longs for the intellectual freedom of Europe, but the lack of community and the lack of family there, right, makes it a really alienating place for her. And so then at that point, she actually would rather be in Tehran, even under restrictions on speech and dress and everything, because at least she's in a community of people that care for each other. So I really, appreciate the way that the film doesn't allow us to have a sort of, good, bad, kind of simplistic take on East-West, but rather, she has these different experiences in both places, and they each fulfill some part of her humanity, but she can't find a place where she gets both of those, which I think is the really tragic thing about the film. That she has to choose between being able to consume the culture and sort of think the free thoughts that she wants to think, just to choose between that and having family and community around her.
Yeah, really good stuff. I mean, right, it's interesting. The film, this theme, this sort of East-West dynamic is, coiled into so many other pieces and dimensions of the film. I mean, certainly there's an element where we are getting to, the film is released in France. It's, I think initially mostly seen in the Western world, and it gives a sort of, picture of life inside Iran that might be informative to some of us. I mean, it's interesting because we see too, not just American, culture, British culture with Iron Maiden, I guess, but we also see Japanese culture. We see them watching Godzilla, I think.
Yeah.
And there's a point where somebody's watching what looks like a Japanese historical drama, maybe a geisha movie or something, on TV. And Bruce Lee is in there, so maybe that's coming by way of America, but maybe it's coming by way of Hong Kong. And so, a Terminator 2, of course, quintessentially American, maybe.
Right. Her husband, remember when he's he's watching Schwarzenegger.
Yeah. The universal element. But so we see kind of the cross-section of cultures and the sort of flow of, different, pop influences that kind of course through. But I mean, it's, Amy, you used the words black and white to describe, the characterization either of the West and of Iran. And of course, black and white is a dynamic that plays in this film too, in the aesthetic style. I mean, we have this, I do think the film is kind of, posing these oppositions, but also, part of Marjan's, journey, I guess, is to sort of find herself in between them. I mean, she finds that she's not in one or the other. Is she Marjan, or is she Mary Jane, or Marie Jean, as she identifies herself? And that's something that she needs to work out for herself in the course of the film. And of course, she finds she doesn't belong in Europe, she thinks, and but she has a hard time fitting in Tehran once she goes back too. Deborah, I see you have a hand raised. Please unmute yourself. Let's hear your thoughts.
I guess I was thinking, I mean, I didn't think of all the issues of that being the West and coming into their culture so much as it was kind of universal adolescence. I mean, kids all over the world listen to this stuff. So I was just thinking about her trying to be a normal adolescent, and her society wasn't letting her. Not just this, to me, awful music would shock her parents, but that's what kids listen to in order to shock their parents. I mean, that's adolescence. So, I mean, I'm in these groups where they're language groups. So they're people from all over the world, Asia and Africa and, not just Europe and the States. And boy, and they're young. So, I mean, they're talking about things I have no clue what they're talking about, but it's all this kind of music.
Mm. So we do come to this, right, this kind of in between, state, or this sort of this overlapping state between these different spheres, and some of that comes through, the culture, and the sort of cultural cross-pollination, we could call it.
But what I'm saying is that's normal for adolescents, and she's trying to be a normal adolescent, but she's got to go buy these things on the black market.
Yes.
And it's her country that's not letting her or her culture not letting her have a normal adolescence.
Indeed. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, some of it too, I think, is there's this one of the things that sort of calls us to challenge this binary is the universal adolescent experience, and the ways that young people are always seeking out, paths of connection, and also the sort of basic human experiences they're going through. Amy, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, I would agree that that she is sort of doing a quote normal teenage thing, but that it again, I think it's more of a rebellion. She doesn't need to rebel against her parents as much, because she has this sort of much greater oppressive force in her life that is constraining her much more than her parents do. So I think it is, it's universal in one sense, but then I think it's specific in another way to, the family that she's from, and then the political environment that she's in, where that's one of the few ways to express opposition to the government.
So I see we have a hand from Annette. Annette, please unmute yourself. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Amy. Wanted to bring up the fact, point you made earlier, that Iran pre-revolution was a very westernized civilization culture. So she went from a 9-year-old kid being able to purchase music, American music, Western music freely, to where within a few months it was outlawed. Mm-hmm. So she had to go to the black market. So I do agree, her resistance, her rebellion was against the government, not as much as her parents, because her parents were not it was obvious that they were affluent because they were able to send her out of the country at 13 years of age and be able to get her out while they could. I found it interesting. I think most of her coming of age was not only in Iran, was actually when she was in Europe, and she had to grow up as a 13-year-old, or a 12-year-old, she was on her own, having to grow up, having to take adult responsibilities, having to figure out where to live, and which influenced her greatly and made her become more vocal and be more independent and stand up to for herself. Because although she went back because she missed her family and she missed that security, she still had that. Everyone was fascinated about how she was influenced in Europe and what she could do, and because they kept asking her, like, did you have a boyfriend? Did you, all those questions, which I thought was very interesting, because then she felt the restrictedness of the country, that in a few years, she had forgotten how she couldn't do anything. So I thought that was very interesting. So keep them, yeah.
Thanks for your remarks, Annette. Amy, do you want to speak to Annette's comments, and perhaps also about Margie's time in Europe?
Yeah. I mean, some of those scenes in Austria or in Vienna are really heartbreaking, to think of, as you said, Annette, like how young she was. And, her parents thinking that they were sending her to, a friend and somebody who would take care of her. And the film just really sort of doesn't gloss over, but it just doesn't provide a lot of explanation. It's just all of a sudden her mother's friend thought their place was too small and she had to go somewhere else. And then we see, what I think could be typical sometimes when kids are going through really hard things, that they want to hide it from their parents. And she's very aware of how her parents, were grieving her leaving at the airport, in both scenes, they're crying. She sees her mother faint, when she turns back that one time. And her mother was sort of trying to put on a good face, but as soon as she thought Margie had turned her back, then she let the grief just took over. But then Margie looks back and sees it, so she's very conscious of what her parents are going through, and then I think tries to hide from them the troubles that she had in Vienna, to the point where it seems as if she doesn't ever tell them that she was homeless, and that she got that sick and all of that stuff. But yeah, I think, one of the other sort of coming of age experiences she has in Vienna is, like, at first, remember the scene where she's like, I wanted to see a European supermarket, right? And she sort of like gleefully, like, almost sails through the aisles of the grocery store, which is, by the way, one of the things I love about the animation in this film is that, like, there's certain scenes that become kind of surreal, or, they violate the laws of physics. She floats or something instead of walking. And these are ways that animation can develop the subjectivity or the inner emotions of the characters in ways that live action film can't. So the grocery store scene is one of those, right? And then she sort of, the narrator, her sort of says, I kind of ruefully, I really needed to get a life because the most fun thing the most fun times I had were shopping at the grocery store. But anyway, my major point is that she's experiencing the sort of abundance of, a Western European capital city. And, takes a lot of joy in that, being able to eat whatever she wants to. But then, as she sort of gets more and more into her friends who are very cynical about everything, as I mentioned before, then she kind of, I think, is seeing the hollowness of the life, that, she's enjoying material abundance. But sort of spiritually, she doesn't, I think, feel like there's much there. So that's sort of part of her coming of age also, I think, is, sort of understanding what a wealthy capitalist country can provide, but then also what the people lack, or at least the people she runs into, they lack a sense of moral compass or any kind of purpose in life, because they're not fighting for something that they really believe in the way that her family at home in Iran is.
One of the things that I'd like to ask you about, Amy, and you about Community, are the sort of roles of, I don't know what, having a sort of spiritual core, whether that is, actual spirituality, actual religion, or, a sort of sense of greater purpose. We see her in conversation, sort of metaphysical conversation at various points, both with God and with
Karl Marx. I love that. I love that scene when they're talking to each other.
I mean, so I'm interested to hear your thoughts, Amy, and again, your thoughts, everybody else, about kind of how those two threads kind of play out in Margie's story. I see we have a hand. Let's go back to Glossman's. And Amy, I'm interested to hear your response on this.
Well, I wasn't sure whether there were others waiting, but there were two things that were coming up to my mind. One is, and you sort of were referencing other orthodoxies, and I was drawn to the film Unorthodox and the growing up in that community, rebelling in a different way, getting a freedom in a different way, and whether you and Amy might want to compare and contrast. And then I think one of the other listeners and Amy were mentioning language, and I was drawn to Sorry to Bother You, which one of the other film clubs that we have been doing for the same length of time as BMFI. Some of the listeners were very bothered by language there, and others not at all, because that's part of the film. And perhaps you might want to comment on how films can and do, and I'm going to say maybe should, shock the viewer sometimes, and what some of that might come into filmmaking.
Amy, we have harsh language, shock effect.
Mhm.
We have orthodoxy. We have God, and we have Karl Marx on the table.
That's a lot. Well, I was going to say first, I
Let's
want to
hear you
join
put
the
it all together.
Wait, I did all those except Karl Marx.
I was going to say first, I want to join the film club that's talking about Sorry to Bother You. I had the pleasure of teaching that film last year and didn't tell the students about some of the crazy stuff that happens at the end, so they were quite shocked. But anyway, yeah, I didn't sort of imagine I'd be thinking about Persepolis and Sorry to Bother You at the same time. But yeah, I mean, to me, you know, a film that's especially a film that's about a marginalized group in some way, and sort of in whatever way you want to define that, you know, that has experiences that might be, you know, counter to the mainstream or unusual in the mainstream of whatever society we're talking about. To me, those films should shock or make you uncomfortable a little bit, because the whole point is that they're offering like a counter narrative to the dominant narrative, you know, in the culture. So, but yeah, so maybe to get back to God and Karl Marx, you know, it's interesting because we don't really get a sense of her family as being religious in any way, but where I see her, you know, what I might call more spirituality is her respect for her ancestors and her family members who died, you know, in sort of because of causes that they believed in. And so her going to her grandfather's grave, and then to outside the prison where her uncle was killed, before she leaves. And she has these moments that I would describe as spiritual. And so yeah, so it might not be so much about religion, but the fact that God is in her dream, it clearly means that she, as a child, is thinking about sort of these big spiritual questions. And then, you know, seeing Karl Marx as sort of a counter to God, I just love it as a way to, you know, you can picture an adolescent trying to sort of make sense of competing ideologies, but then seeing those ideologies as like people that are arguing with each other. And that's another scene that you could not have done in live action, right? It would be incredibly cheesy to have, you know, somebody acting as God and somebody acting as Karl Marx talking to each other. You know, I just can't imagine how that would work in live action, but it works great in animation. So yeah, I don't know that I said anything terribly profound, but that basically that, you know, she's sort of trying to navigate between these different ways of seeing the world that seem to have both come from her family to some extent, and trying to figure out how, you know, is it possible to hold both of them at her head at once? You know, can she think about, you know, maybe a God that cares for, because that's kind of how we see, right? She's really depressed, and, you know, it appears verging on suicidal. And so in her dream, you know, God is holding the hand out, and sort of she's a tiny person sort of being almost like a baby bird in a nest, you know, it's a very caretaking God. And then, you know, Karl Marx, obviously, she's, you know, is not so much about taking care of people, but more about, you know, critiquing the underlying system of capitalism that is motivating so much of what is happening to her, even if it's indirectly, right? Through the, you know, I said in my introduction, you know, US and British oil interests, right, were a large reason why the political revolutions were supported, and, you know, weapons were given and such. So, you know, capitalism is very much responsible in a way for the position that she's in. And so, you know, it kind of seems to me like a young person who's trying to figure out, is there space in the world for both of these ways of looking at the world?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the sentiment that both those figures kind of join, I guess, meet on is, I think, is go. Where I noted it down what the quote is. They say, "Go do what you have to do." They say the struggle continues.
Right.
You know,
And God responds and says, "Yes, the struggle
yes, the
continues."
struggle continues. I mean, you know, both of these are. I mean, this is an ethos that's been sort of imparted in her by not by spiritual or, you know, historical, you know, figures in her life like Karl Marx, but by, you know, her immediate family and her family's legacy. So she does find a continuity there. You know, and it's interesting too that's, you know, it's sort of after that scene where we see her start to emerge as an artist. I should say, I think it's worth noting that, it's interesting that she can find some relationship, or at least some kind of vibe with I don't know, a sort of spiritual purpose in whatever way you want to think about that, in light of being in, a fairly authoritarian theocracy, and this is sort of one of the ways that she seems to be able to, I don't know, to sort of stay true to herself, or kind of find herself and root and anchor in herself and her beliefs and in her convictions, I guess, and her commitments, despite whatever, the context or whatever is happening, outside. This is kind of some of the inner strength that she starts to develop over the film. The eye of the tiger, perhaps we could call it. So let's go to Sophia. Sophia, please unmute yourself.
So I think we talked a lot about earlier about coming of age and rebellion, and I actually found it interesting. I think that the only time we actually see her rebelling against her parents' ideals are when she's really religious. I mean, they're clearly very not, and it's kind of like an early adolescence kicking in at 10 in this way. I think it also goes into Marjan's own maturity. I think she reaches certain levels in her upbringing maybe earlier than other people do. But I found it really interesting that religion kind of played in.
Amy, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking as you were talking about when her mother weeps at the day that she's getting married and says, this isn't what I wanted for you. I wanted you to be a free, independent woman, and instead you're marrying at 21. So yeah, so that you could definitely read that as in that moment or that phase of her development, she's trying to conform in a way to the society around her and against her parents. Although it also seems like, she just wants to be with this guy, and the only way for them to be together is to get married, because they're going to get in trouble if they're seen in public with each other unmarried. But yeah, I think you could definitely sort of see her trying that out. And I thought, Jacob, what you said about religion was quite, I hadn't sort of really directly put together with the dream and her sort of this very paternal caretaking God, which is really a contrast with the God that's being evoked by these religious police, that in order to preserve people's virtue, right, the women have to be covered, and the young boys are told that if they go to war and they die, then they will be martyred and have all these rewards in heaven. And so when you think about that compared to Margie's vision of God, then you can see, a completely different approach to religion there.
I see that we have a comment in our chat section. This is coming from Janet, who says, can you discuss the style of animation? Amy, you touched on this a little bit in your introduction. Would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yes. And I have to say, I'm no animation expert, so I can't give you a lot of technical terms or sort of, the technical background behind how it was done. But I can talk about it, just sort of artistically, like what we see. And I think what's so interesting is that the animation style changes depending on what the scene is. And so when she hears her father talk about Iranian history, and sort of how the recent, older history, but also the recent history of US and British intervention in Iranian politics, that's illustrated in this very sort of ornate, more traditional Persian style of drawing. And, so there's a lot of detail to it, a lot of shading. And then a lot of the scenes when she's young are in very sort of stark, black versus white, right? There's not a lot of shades of gray. There's not a lot of detail. The humans are drawn pretty simply, and we sort of just see them in silhouette sometimes, or we see very very few lines to sort of create texture and stuff like that. So it's sort of like almost like a child style of animation, or sort of a simple children's cartoon. It doesn't have a lot of wrinkles or texture on it. And, so that sort of echoes Margie's experiences as she's young. And we also see that, in Vienna. But then there's, a lot of her dream moments go back to having a lot of gradation, a lot of sort of grays and texture to them. So there's a way in which, almost her mental life is more intricate than the physical reality that she's seeing around her. And so that's one sort of stylistic choice I really appreciate in this film, the way that the style of drawing sort of mimics where she is emotionally, scenes of her depression, right? There's just a sort of like the frame is dominated by a complete black. And then, we can, as I've alluded to a couple of times, we can see her, doing things that aren't physically possible for humans to do, so sort of flying through the air, or I'm thinking of this scene like where she and her boyfriend in Vienna are, it's like sort of the height of their in love, and she sort of shows the car like weaving through the streets, but the car is almost like flying. And then, of course, you get the hilarious scene right after she finds out that he cheated on her. And so he goes from being, the most beautiful romantic guy ever to this guy, like, picking his nose, and he's got warts all over his face, and he's being like super gross, and so, then that neither of those is really true, right? So that we're not seeing like an objective reality. We are seeing her subjective experience of being in love, and the sort of like, the person who you're in love with is perfect and can do no wrong. And so we go from that extreme to the total opposite of, he's gross and horrible. And that's just all her head, right? That's like how she's experiencing it. And so I think animation is just used in a really kind of expressive, wonderful way here. And then I guess the last thing I'd say is we mentioned color at the very beginning, right? A few pops of color, and the color is only at the airport. And this is, I think we're supposed to imagine the sort of present day of the film, right? So Marjane Satrapi as, maybe not the age she was when the film was made, but sort of older than most of the years that the film depicts. So she's in this in between space, right? The airport is, a famous example of what we call like a liminal space, and in between, one country and another. And so it's interesting that those are the full color, or not, they're not even full color, but those are the moments where we get the splashes of color. And so, I think in one sense, maybe that's literal to represent the current time versus the past. But potentially, I think it also speaks to the fact that she doesn't feel at home in either place, in Iran or in Vienna or in France, where she goes later. And that the airport is just this place where she's kind of alone with her thoughts. She's not talking to anybody. She's kind of sitting and thinking and remembering. And those are the moments where the color comes. And so you wonder if the film is sort of illustrating the way in which maybe, the only time that she can sort of inhabit both of her worlds, or mentally like sort of think about both places and both cultures together is in the space of transition, that the place that she keeps coming back to every time she goes back and forth between Europe and Iran. So yeah, those are some thoughts on animation.
Yeah, I think that's so astute, Amy. I'm so glad that you talked about the color. I think that's really on point, and ties into a lot of the themes that we've been talking about in the course of our discussion. Yeah, so many funny, expressive animation parts too. I thought the scene where she's like describing her her body changing as she hits puberty, and you sort of see her like left foot like tearing out of her shoe.
Mhm.
It's extremely funny.
Her face like all distorted.
Yeah, it's like angular. I will supplement that just by adding a couple interesting anecdotal things that I came across while doing a little bit of research. I'll start by reminding everybody that this is drawn from a graphic novel that Satrapi drew, so there is a sort of primary visual source to it, and so one of the things that Satrapi said about her comic, and the film does sort of emulate, the visual style of her comic, and to a great extent. She said, quote, "I always thought that what I had to say was too much. It was complicated with lots and lots of words. So I had to go very mellow on the other side, because otherwise the rhythm of reading would be destroyed. That's why I went for something black and white, completely, with an extremely minimalistic emphasis, because I thought it was best for the rhythm of reading." So, I mean, there is this sort of there is perhaps something functional about sort of stripping the style down, but as Amy talked about as well, that sort of aesthetic choice and the sharp black and white, and then the way that grades out at certain points, I think fits in with a lot of the themes we've been discussing about these sort of oppositions in her life and her sort of space in between them. I'll also note that I read Satrapi noted that she had a lot of difficulty at the outset of the process drawing women in the film because when she was training as an artist, she never had the occasion to draw the bodies of women that were not, garbed. So, it's interesting that she includes that in her, in the story itself. But she, attributes some of her sort of minimalistic, sort of simplistic style to that. I think it's still a very
fascinating.
expressive style. Yeah, it is interesting.
Yeah.
We are coming towards the end of our time here, but I think we would be remiss without, I don't know, maybe touching on how this film feels, at the moment where we find ourselves now, where there's a lot of stuff going on in Iran, much of which resonates with the themes in the film. Is that something you can speak to, Amy?
Yeah. I was really happy in a way that we selected this film some months ago because, as you say, the timing is, kind of surprising. But it feels really meaningful to me to watch this film at this time, as as we think about the young people who are leading the protests in Iran, and the fact that, those protests started over a young woman who was arrested and died in jail because she was letting a little bit of her hair show. And we have those moments in the film where Margie, she has her scarf on, but you can see sort of a little bit of her hair. And at one point, one of the police, says, like, adjust your scarf or something like that. I forget what the exact word is, but she's called on the fact that she is letting a little bit of her hair show, right? And that's exactly what happened to the woman who died, whose death set off the protests. And so, I've heard news commentators talk a little bit about, like, why the hijab, why head covering as being the sort of spark for this revolutionary energy that we're seeing in Iran now, which is, expanding to a lot of other complaints against the government and the social oppression that they live under. But why did it start with women covering their hair? And I think you can see in this film, in a way, what that means. That the women in her family don't want to wear that and feel constrained by it. Her grandmother says as much, and that it becomes a symbol of clamping down on freedom of expression, sort of, the way that we kind of craft our appearance, right, is expressing something about ourselves to the world. And so women, being forced to cover their hair and all of their bodies except for their face becomes symbolic of the whole population not being able to express things about themselves. And I think you can see, like, the sort of the pain of living under a regime where you have to sort of watch what you say to who, and you don't know who's going to be watching you in the street. That sort of feeling of constant surveillance. And so, I think the film, for those of us who aren't Iranian and don't know a lot other than what we read, the film sort of gives us the more experiential side of it. Like, what does it feel like to have, been able to dress how you want and then have to stop, right? And the lengths that people go to get around some of these rules, like the illegal parties with alcohol, and that it was so important to people to have those, because not because that's the pinnacle of life necessarily, but just because that was one small way that they could sort of be themselves. So anyway, it feels really important to see this film and think of it in the context of what's happening right now. And that, again, that it's a movement that's largely led by the younger generation, which is what Satrapi's coming of age story represents.
Thanks for sharing that, Amy. Well said. My friends, I'm afraid that we've come to the end of our time. As always, it's a pleasure to talk movies with you, and we will be back again on January 9th with our next film discussion. We'll be announcing the title featured at that discussion on Thursday, so please keep your eye on our website and our emails. I'll give you a special teaser for those with us tonight, which is that the session will be co-moderated by myself and BMFI Deputy Director Andrew Douglas, whom those of you who've participated in these sessions for a long time will have gotten to know well. So we'll be taking a break from our film studies offerings over the holiday, but we'll be picking back up in January. You can see some of what's on the agenda below. Let me give a special shout out to our February 22nd seminar on the 400 Blows, which Amy will be teaching. The 400 Blows, of course, being one of the key films of the French New Waves. And hey, it's just been restored, so it's a great time to see it on the big screen. Amy will help us dive into it and open it up a little bit.
It's a great connection to coming of age, by the way.
Absolutely. One of the quintessential coming of age films. Both films about Hellraisers, really, Persepolis and 400. Well, listen, friends, we've got new releases as well. You can see what's playing at BMFI right now on this screen, and we have some new titles coming in for the holidays. So please do check out brynmarfilm.org to learn more about all of the upcoming education offerings and special programming and coming attractions and so forth. Lastly, if you like what we do and you haven't yet become a member, well, please consider joining. Not only will you be supporting a great community institution, if we do say so ourselves, but hey, it's a great deal too. Membership gets you 40% off movie tickets, gets you discounted tuition to education offerings, and there's much more than that. And so if you have the means also to make a gift to BMFI, well, that's always appreciated too. Your patronage and your support has allowed us to stay on firm footing and will allow us to continue providing community-oriented programming well into the future.
And don't forget the tax deduction part.
Hey, good point. Good point. Don't forget it.
There's many ways to give.
Listen, preach on, David. Well, let me thank all of you again for a great discussion. I hope you will all join me in giving a very special thanks to Amy. I wish you all very happy holidays and can't wait to catch up with you next time. Thanks a lot, Amy.
Yeah,
Thanks a
it
lot,
was a
everybody.
pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
And so long. Good night.
Thank you both for all you